So as we're about to see with Jesus, he very frequently does the exact same thing. So I have a slideshow that I'm going to share. So I preached a sermon. This was back in January. First time I preached since starting div school, actually. And it was a very fun sermon to preach. I taught on basically Jesus' answer to the question, what's the greatest commandment? I've talked about this several times on the podcast, so I'm not going to go over the whole thing, but I want us to look at Jesus' sermon and what it is that he does with the sermon, and really think about the complexity of this and how Jesus is a very good teacher, because he is very technically skilled. So I'll pull up the slideshow. Is that coming through all right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So there was a typical rabbinic parable structure that the rabbis would use around that time. It was priest, Levite, Pharisee. This was typically used by Pharisaic rabbis, and they would.
There's a reason for that.
Yes, there's a reason for that, and that's where I'm going. The parable structure, you would take these three characters, the priest, the Levite, and the Pharisee, and you'd put them into the same situation and see how they behaved. And you'd notice ways in which they behaved differently or the same. And typically, the Pharisees pitching this parable, they'd have the priest behave in some way in accordance with the law that they disagreed with. Then you'd have the Levite behave in a way in accordance with the law that they disagreed with. And then the Pharisee would do the correct thing in fulfilling the law.
Mm-hmm.
So in Luke 10, we get an interesting example of someone asking Jesus a question. Teacher, what is your favorite, or what is the, not your favorite, what is the greatest commandment? What's the heaviest commandment? Which commandment weighs the most? And Jesus gives the typical response. In some of the gospel accounts, Jesus actually asks the student or the lawyer asking the question, what do you say it is? And in some, he just gives them the answer. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself is how it's typically translated. We've gone over translation before. Go check that out. I think it was a really productive episode. So we have that, right? Jesus gives that answer, and then the student follows it up with an answer themselves, or another question, I should say. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied with a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. Now, what's interesting, and what I talk about a little bit in this sermon that I gave, is going between Jerusalem and Jericho is the typical route you take when you're going from Jerusalem to the Galilee in the north, but you want to go around Samaria because Jews and Samaritans did not get along. So this person's on this road, presumably to avoid interacting with Samaritans, getting into a quote unquote bad neighborhood. And he fell into the hands of robbers, so didn't exactly work out, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road. Okay, cool. We have our first person going down the road. How's he going to respond? Is he going to, as Jesus and this lawyer had established earlier, is he going to weigh the commandments properly and love neighbor as self over all of the other commandments? was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. No, he regards ritual purity as more important than, again, this isn't necessarily the guy being a jerk. This is him weighing priorities differently. Now, there is, presumably, he's not on his way to the temple, so he could actually potentially touch a dead thing and be okay. But he still seems to uphold ritual cleanliness over this love of neighbor thing. So he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, we've got our second person, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now remember, well, why is it? Remember, if we go back up here, it's priest, Levite, Pharisee. The Pharisee is the one who's supposed to be doing it correctly. And what do we have? But a Samaritan. And that's when the jaws of everyone in the room drop, because they know that this third person's supposed to be the one who fulfills the law properly. And how could a dirty hick Samaritan fulfill the law properly? That's what's going through their mind. While traveling, came near him. Now remember, this person's presumably on this road to avoid Samaritans. And yet, ironically, the Samaritan in the story is the only person who does what is required of us by the law, what Jesus would have us do, how to be like Jesus. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, and this part gets me every time, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds. Having poured oil and wine on them, he spared no expense in helping this person. And then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." And Jesus finishes this story with a question. And this is where Jesus lays his trap. Because there's no way out of this. And no matter how the lawyer responds, he gets the point. And he came to the conclusion himself. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Which of these 3 men do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. He can't even say Samaritan. The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." Go and do what? Show mercy like the Samaritan. Go be the person that you were trying to avoid. Go do the thing that they did. Go be the person you hate. That's the point of the parable. Love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. That statement, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, we can quote that all the time, but when you listen to this parable, when Jesus teaches this, and you fully understand what it is he's trying to communicate, it punches you in the gut. Because you're called to be the Samaritan and recognize that you very well could be the class of people that you hate. Insert label here. So go love them. That's what it means to teach like Jesus. And that's what it means to be like Jesus. The question I posed at the end of the sermon was, how often do we find ourselves on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem? Because that was a road you went to specifically avoid Samaritans. And the prayer I prayed is that when we find ourselves on a road specifically to avoid people that we dislike, that God would put them in our paths anyway. Because that's exactly what happened in this parable. And if it hadn't happened, this man would be dead. And we get all of that because Jesus carefully constructs a story and asks poignant questions. So don't tell me Jesus isn't a good teacher. And don't tell me we don't need to be like him.